Imagine stepping into a medieval monastery. The air filled not only with incense and prayer, but also with the rich aroma of brewing ale and fermenting wine. For monks, drink was more than pleasure. It was survival, ritual, and even a form of devotion. But how did alcohol shape their daily lives? And why did monasteries become some of the most important breweries in history? In this video, we'll explore the quiet but fascinating story of how monks lived, prayed, and even prospered through beer and wine. Stay with me until the end. You may never look at a glass of ale the same way again. Chapter 1. Brewing in the cloister. The origins of monastic beer and wine. When you imagine a medieval monastery, your mind might turn first to stone cloisters, dimly lit libraries filled with manuscripts, or the quiet chant of monks echoing through a chapel. Yet, if you were to step into the daily rhythm of a monastery in the Middle Ages, you would find another scene just as essential. Barrels of ale fermenting in cool cellars, rows of grapevines stretching toward the horizon, and monks in rough spun robes stirring great kettles of malt and hops. Alcohol, whether in the form of beer, ale, or wine, was not simply a pleasure for monks. It was a necessity, a daily staple, and one of the most enduring legacies of the monastic world. The story of alcohol in monasteries begins with survival. In much of medieval Europe, clean drinking water was not always easy to find. Rivers, streams, and wells often carried contaminants. Without an understanding of microbiology, medieval people nonetheless recognized that water could make them sick. But beer and wine, boiled, fermented, and aged, were safer. For monks who lived together in tightly knit communities, avoiding disease was essential. And so, drink became an inseparable part of their daily life. Monasteries were self-sufficient. Institutions. The Benedictine rule, which shaped the structure of countless monasteries across Europe, emphasized manual labor alongside prayer and study. Brewing and winemaking became part of this labor. A monk's day was divided between the Opus Dei, the work of God, prayer and chanting, and physical work in the fields, kitchens, and breweries. Brewing fit naturally into this rhythm. It was time-consuming, repetitive, and required careful attention, much like prayer itself. In a sense, brewing became another form of devotion. In Northern Europe, beer dominated. Made from barley, oats, or rye, ale was often flavored with herbs before hops became common in the later Middle Ages. The process required grinding malt, heating water, mixing grains, and watching the slow transformation of wort into drink. Monks perfected these steps, recording their knowledge in manuscripts that would outlast the Middle Ages. For monasteries like those in Flanders, Bavaria, and England, beer was not only sustenance but also a source of income. Pilgrims, peasants, and even nobles came to monasteries not just for prayer, but also for a dependable drink. In southern Europe, where grapes grew easily, wine dominated monastic life. Vineyards planted and tended by monks stretched across the landscapes of France, Italy, and Spain. The Cistercians, a reform branch of the Benedictines, became particularly skilled at viticulture. They experimented with soil, pruning, and harvesting techniques, laying the groundwork for regions like Burgundy to become famous for wine centuries later. To drink wine in moderation was seen as acceptable under monastic rules, though drunkenness was strictly condemned. Yet moderation in the Middle Ages still often meant drinking multiple cups of diluted wine each day. Alcohol also had a sacred role in monasteries. Wine was essential for the Mass, the central act of Christian worship. Bread and wine became the body and blood of Christ, and so the vineyard and the cellar were bound up with the holiest acts of faith. Monks therefore approached winemaking with reverence. Similarly, the daily table required drink to accompany simple foods of bread, cheese, beans, and vegetables. Beer and wine added both calories and variety to otherwise plain diets. It is worth noting that monks distinguished between types of drink. In many monasteries, different grades of ale were brewed. A strong ale might be reserved for feast days, while a weaker, small beer was made for daily drinking. Even children in monasteries and surrounding villages consumed small beer, which was low in alcohol but safer than water. This layering of drink into daily and sacred life shows how deeply embedded alcohol was in monastic survival. The reputation of monks as skilled brewers and winemakers grew across Europe. When travelers or pilgrims stopped at a monastery, they could rely on a clean, nourishing drink. Many monasteries sold their surplus in nearby towns, strengthening the economic ties between cloister and community. In some regions, monastic brewing became so important that secular taverns struggled to compete. Monks, bound by discipline and routine, could produce more consistent and reliable drink than ordinary peasants, and yet, alcohol in monasteries was never without tension. The rule of Saint Benedict explicitly warned against drunkenness, calling wine a dangerous indulgence. The ideal, according to Benedict, was abstinence, but he conceded that most people could not live without drink. Therefore, he allowed a small ration of wine each day, perhaps about half a liter. Monks debated endlessly whether this rule was being followed too strictly or too loosely. Some argued for more beer in regions where wine was unavailable. Others worried that the joy of drink might distract from the discipline of prayer. This tension between necessity and temptation is one of the most fascinating aspects of alcohol in the cloister. Monks drank because they needed to, but they also had to watch carefully that drink did not lead them away from devotion. In practice, this meant endless regulations, careful rationing, and punishments for those who overindulged. Despite these rules, stories of drunken monks occasionally appear in chronicles, reminding us that even within the strict walls of a monastery, human weakness remained. As you picture this world, imagine a cloistered courtyard, the smell of brewing, barley hanging in the air, the distant chant of monks rising from the chapel, and in the cool stone cellar, rows of wooden barrels quietly fermenting. The monks' lives were not glamorous. They were filled with labor, repetition, and small comforts. Yet in those repetitive tasks, stirring kettles, pressing grapes, pouring beer into clay cups, the monks laid down traditions that would shape European drinking culture for centuries. But while the monastery cellar and vineyard provided sustenance, the question remains, how exactly did monks structure their daily drinking rituals? How much did they consume, and how did beer and wine fit into the rhythm of prayer and work? Chapter 2. Daily Drinking Rituals. Alcohol as Food, Medicine and Safety. If you step into the daily rhythm of a medieval monastery, you would find a life governed by bells. The tolling of the monastery bell divided the day into hours of prayer, labor, reading, and rest. Beneath this sacred rhythm, another pattern ran quietly but just as persistently: the consumption of beer and wine. To the monks, alcohol was not simply a pleasure or an occasional indulgence. It was woven into the fabric of their survival, shaping meals, health, and even medicine. Drink as food. In the Middle Ages, alcohol was not categorized as a mere beverage. It was food. Beer and ale, in particular, were filled with calories from malted grains, providing essential energy for men who worked in fields, gardens, kitchens, and libraries. The brewing process, which converted starch into sugar and then into alcohol, left behind residual nutrients. Proteins, B vitamins, and carbohydrates were all present in the cloudy, unfiltered brews of the medieval world. For monks who often followed strict dietary rules that limited meat, beer, and wine became nutritional lifelines. A monk might consume 2 to 3 liters of ale daily, sometimes more during fasting periods when solid foods were restricted. The Cistercians, known for their discipline, made allowances for beer as a supplement during Lent and Advent. It was not considered breaking a fast because it was liquid. Thus, alcohol blurred the line between nourishment and indulgence. Wine, though lighter in calories, was also treated as food. Monastic meals typically consisted of bread, beans, cheese, and vegetables. A ration of wine helped wash down the otherwise dry fare, and it was sometimes diluted with water to stretch the supply. Records from the Abbey of Cluny, one of the great Benedictine centers in France, suggest that each monk was given a set daily measure of wine, perhaps about half a liter. On feast days, extra wine might be served, reminding monks of the joy hidden within their austere lives. The order of the day, the way alcohol was consumed within monasteries, followed strict routine. Morning might begin with a small cup of small beer, a weak brew low in alcohol but safer than water. As the day advanced, stronger ale was served at the main meal around midday, alongside bread and pottage. Supper, taken before sunset, included another ration of drink. For some monks, especially in Northern Europe, beer accompanied almost every bite of food. Rules, however, always emphasized moderation. Drunkenness was seen as a spiritual weakness. The rule of Saint Benedict specifically warned that wine should be consumed with restraint, not to excess. But what counted as excess? Here the line blurred. Chroniclers note debates within monasteries about how many cups were too many. Some abbots restricted portions strictly. Others allowed more generous measures. The fact remains that for men engaged in daily labor, the consumption of multiple pints of beer or wine was not unusual, and the effect was not always sobriety. Alcohol is medicine. Beyond food, alcohol had a medicinal role. Monks were among the most knowledgeable healers in medieval Europe, and their infirmaries stocked remedies drawn from herbs, roots, and minerals. Alcohol became both a solvent and a cure. Wine was used to mix with herbs for tinctures. It was believed to cleanse wounds, aid digestion, and strengthen the heart. Ale, rich in nutrients, was prescribed for the weak or sick. In monastic hospitals, patients might be given spiced wine to ease pain or flavored ale to restore appetite. Recipes for medicinal wines survive in monastic manuscripts, wine infused with wormwood for stomach problems, wine mixed with rosemary for memory, or sweetened spiced wines to warm the body during winter chills. Alcohol carried the active ingredients of herbs more effectively than water, making it a key tool in medieval pharmacology. Alcohol also served as a comfort for the dying. Monks tending to the sick often offered diluted wine as a final solace. In this way, alcohol touched not only the daily sustenance of life, but also its final moments. The question of safety. It is important to remember why alcohol became so deeply rooted in daily life. Safety. Water sources in medieval Europe were not consistently clean. Wells might be contaminated by animal waste, latrines, or stagnant conditions. Even flowing rivers carried risks. While boiling water could purify it, boiling was time-consuming and required precious firewood. Brewing, on the other hand, achieved both purification and preservation. The fermentation process killed harmful organisms, and the mild alcohol content prevented spoilage. For monks, who lived in close quarters and often welcomed travelers, safe drink was essential. Beer and wine reduced the spread of illness. Even weak beer offered more security than raw water. Thus, alcohol was not a luxury, but a necessity of communal survival. Ritual and symbolism. The act of drinking also carried symbolic weight. In the refectory, the monastery dining hall, monks ate in silence, while one brother read aloud from scripture or saints' lives. Drinking wine or ale was part of this communal ritual. Cups were raised not in toast, but in the quiet rhythm of shared life. Every sip reinforced the unity of the community. At the same time, alcohol was linked with the sacred. Wine was indispensable for the Eucharist, the central act of Christian worship. Each day, when monks celebrated Mass, bread and wine were consecrated and consumed as the body and blood of Christ. In this sense, the vineyard and cellar were bound directly to spiritual life. the mundane act of pressing grapes and fermenting. Wine became a holy labor, tied to salvation itself, contradictions and concerns, yet contradictions abounded. While monks saw drink as food, medicine, and safety, critics accused them of indulgence. Some chronicles mockingly report monks who stumbled from too much ale. The Cistercians, reformers who sought stricter discipline, criticized older Benedictine houses for their generosity with wine. And yet, even the Cistercians could not avoid drink. Their houses in northern Europe brewed beer extensively, and their vineyards in France became famous for fine wines. This paradox strict rules against drunkenness alongside daily reliance on alcohol remained unresolved. Alcohol was too essential to eliminate, yet too dangerous to fully embrace. Every monastery navigated this tension in its own way, with rules, punishments, and reminders of moderation. Still, the image of monks as heavy drinkers lingered in popular imagination, and perhaps with some truth, as you reflect on this daily rhythm, the bell tolling, monks gathering for silent meals, cups of ale set beside bowls of pottage, you can see how alcohol was not merely a background detail, but a central feature of survival. It sustained their bodies, healed their illnesses, and carried deep spiritual meaning. But this daily rhythm also gave rise to something much larger. Monks did not just drink for themselves. Their brewing and winemaking spilled over into the wider world. How did monasteries transform from self-sufficient communities into centers of commercial brewing and viticulture, influencing European drinking culture for centuries? Chapter 3. Brewing Beyond the Cloister, the Monastic Legacy of Alcohol. When you imagine the quiet stillness of a medieval cloister, you might think of candlelit chapels, whispered prayers, and the scratching of quills on parchment. But alongside these sacred rhythms was another sound, the bubbling of fermentation vats, the trickle of wine into barrels, and the laughter of monks sharing ale in the refectory. What began as survival turned into something much larger, a tradition that shaped medieval life far beyond monastery walls. Brewing as discipline and devotion. For monks, brewing beer or tending vineyards was more than practical necessity. It was also a form of prayer. Manual labor was central to Benedictine life, and brewing was an act of humility, a way to serve both the brotherhood and the wider community. Every step malting barley, stirring mash, straining wort required patience and precision. In that discipline, monks saw the order of creation itself, and yet even discipline could lead to innovation. By carefully recording recipes, adjusting brewing times, and experimenting with ingredients, monasteries became centers of brewing expertise. The introduction of hops into brewing, for instance, likely spread through monastic channels. Hopped beer lasted longer, tasted sharper, and could be stored for months rather than days. This was not merely a convenience, it was transformative for trade and survival. Surplus in the market. What happens when a community brews more than it consumes? For monasteries, the answer was both simple and complicated. Surplus ale and wine were often distributed as charity gifts to the poor, offerings to pilgrims, or sustenance for travelers at the abbey gate. But not all surplus could be given away. Gradually, monasteries became economic hubs. Beer and wine were sold to townsfolk, exchanged in markets, and even supplied to nobility. A reputation soon developed. Monastic beer was pure, reliable, and of high quality. Cistercian wines, for example, became prized across Europe, with Burgundy's vineyards still bearing their influence today. This success raised questions. Was commerce compatible with the vow of poverty? The rule of Saint Benedict had warned monks against greed and excess. Yet by the 14th century, some abbeys were known as much for their cellars as for their sanctity. The paradox could not be ignored. Monks had perfected a craft that brought both survival and temptation. Taverns of the cloister. It might surprise you to learn that monasteries sometimes operated taverns. Pilgrims arriving at a shrine were offered ale, and travelers could refresh themselves at inns run by monks. In some places, monastic taverns became gathering points for entire villages. The same monks who prayed in silence by day might pour beer for lay guests by evening. This dual role reinforced the monastery's place in society. It was not only a house of God, but also a center of hospitality. Food, drink, and lodging were extensions of charity. Yet this also blurred the line between sacred and secular. If monks could brew and sell ale, could they also enjoy it beyond moderation? Critics thought not. Criticism and satire. Medieval writers often poked fun at monks for their drinking. Tales circulated of abbots with cellars full of rare vintages, or friars too fond of taverns. Paintings and woodcuts occasionally depicted monks with round bellies and mugs in hand. The image of the drunken monk became a stock character in satire, a reminder of the gap between holy ideals and human habits. But beneath the satire lay truth. Alcohol was woven deeply into the fabric of monastic life. It was not indulgence alone, it was diet, medicine, and ritual. Still, the reputation of excess lingered, feeding debates about the spiritual dangers of worldly pleasures. Lasting legacy. Despite the criticism, monastic brewing and winemaking left a legacy that shaped Europe. Many of today's wine appellations, especially in France, can be traced back to medieval monasteries. Likewise, the rich brewing traditions of Belgium and Germany owe much to monastic refinement. Even now, beers labeled Trappist or Abbey carry the echo of centuries-old practices. It is telling that, long after the suppression of monasteries, during the Reformation, their brewing traditions survived. Some abbeys were restored, others passed their recipes into secular hands, but the memory of monks as guardians of brewing remained. To this day, a glass of Trappist beer carries not just flavor but history, reflection. When you look back at the alcohol-filled lives of medieval monks, you see a paradox. Drink was a necessity, keeping waterborne diseases at bay. It was nourishment, sustaining monks through fasts and long workdays. It was ritual, sanctified in the Eucharist. And yet, it was also a source of wealth, temptation, and reputation. The monks who brewed in silence could never have known that their careful labor would echo across centuries. Their barrels and cellars shaped not only their own survival, but also Europe's culture of drink. And so, you are left with a lingering thought. Did alcohol strengthen monastic life by sustaining it, or weaken it by drawing monks ever closer to the worldly pleasures they sought to renounce? Thank you for spending this quiet time with me here on Quiet Boring Sleep. If you enjoyed this gentle journey into history, I'd love it if you could give the video a like, and maybe share it with a friend who enjoys drifting off to the past. And if you'd like more stories like this to fall asleep to, don't forget to subscribe. Really helps me bring you more of these calming, boring histories. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.